great.
My lady, the next witness, please, is Robert Joyce.
Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long, Mr. Joyce.
Mr. Joyce, you have provided an expert report to the inquiry, and I'll give the reference INQ 0005883131. And just by way of introduction to you professionally, you're an economist with an expertise in the microeconomics of public policy and a particular specialism in labour markets, welfare, tax policy and economic inequality. Is that right?
That's right.
And you're a director at Alma Economics.
That's right.
You're instructed by the inquiry to prepare a report examining the key economic issues facing the United Kingdom during the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular to explore the challenges and trade-offs that the economic policy response faced. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, we'll come on to this a little more in the substantive questions, but you were not asked and have not provided a comprehensive overview and assessment of all elements of the economic response, nor an evaluation, if you like, in terms of how you rate the response. Is that right?
That's correct.
So can we, first of all, as a topic, just look at the nature of the shock that was caused by COVID-19? And we've heard lots of evidence in the inquiry that it was unprecedented, and I think everyone agrees about that. But what was different about this shock in terms of the issues that it raised and how it materialised?
The main distinctive features are, first of all, that it affected so many different domains of life, and in particular of economic life, at the same time. So, in particular, it was a large shock to demand, like many recessions are. But it was also something that affected the supply side of the economy directly as well. So, essentially, the avoidance of social contact is associated with a lot of reductions in different kinds of consumption, so that's the demand side, but it also inhibits the supply side of the economy as well, because lots of production relies on the social contact. And of course, once you add in not only the effects of there being a contagious virus, but also the effects of restrictions imposed in response to it, it only makes that story clearer. So you've got simultaneous shocks both to the demand side of the economy and the supply side of the economy. That creates particular challenges because the kind of policy response that is appropriate to deal with a shock depends on what kind of shock it is, including, very importantly, whether it's a demand or a supply side shock and the mix between the two.
Mr. Joyce, can I just, as an opening request, ask you to slow down a little bit? Don't worry, I've asked nearly every witness to slow down. It's just a note's being taken in live time, and so just a little slower.
Not a problem at all. So that's really the first way in which this was distinctive, in that it disrupted fundamentally different parts of the economy a lot at the same time, in a way that complicated the policy response, and also, I think, put an unusual degree of strain on the machinery of government, because you have to respond to different problems in different parts of the economy. The other distinctive feature that I think I would pull out at a high level is the interaction between the economic crisis and the public health crisis. So again, to trace it back, essentially the whole reason why there was an economic crisis is because the avoidance of social contact, whether voluntary or mandated, has economic implications. Some of the usual responses of a government to a recession would be to try to, for example, stimulate demand in order to mitigate the impacts of the recession. But that was always at tension with reintroducing the kind of social contact that was causing the problems in the first place, or that was the concern in the first place and was the reason for some of the restrictions. So there was this dynamic interplay between the health crisis and the economic crisis, and they could both have feedback effects on each other, which made the whole problem, I think, much, much more complicated to understand and respond to.
I mean, we heard from Mr. Sunak in his evidence that in a normal economic shock, it will occur within the economy. Its origins will be within the economy, and so you can respond to that by a policy response. But here, the origin was in a health crisis, and therefore the economic response had to follow the health crisis, so it had to be reactionary to that. So that's a novel feature, is it, in terms of an economic shock?
It is, absolutely. And then the fact that, again, then the economic response that you implement could have its own impacts on the public health crisis.
It works both ways.
So, yeah.
Yeah. There's a sort of feedback loop of one affecting the other.
Exactly.
And also estimating the trajectory of the health crisis was near impossible. So therefore, does that put a strain on your ability to know what policy levers to pull and when from an economic perspective?
Yes, it can certainly complicate that picture. There are kinds of economic policy responses that might become more or less desirable depending on how long you have to implement them for. So we might come back to this perhaps in more detail in relation to specific schemes. But for example, the notion of trying to preserve the pre-pandemic structure of jobs, of who's in which job, which is a part of what the furlough scheme was doing, is something that can become relatively less attractive the longer you have to do it for. In addition, it was unclear what the long-term effects of the crisis would be on the structure of the economy itself. So, would there be or to what extent would there be a permanent shift towards more remote working, more online retail? All of these things might mean that the post-pandemic economy would look different from the pre-pandemic economy. In a way that, again, would affect how desirable it would be to try to preserve the pre-pandemic economy as it was. So, yeah, the uncertainty over the duration of the pandemic and of its long-term effects on the economy, I think also further complicated how to think about what the right response was.
So you don't want to preserve a sort of economic model that's become redundant because behaviours have changed in response to the crisis that remain after it's passed.
Exactly, to the extent that the future looks different from the past, and therefore the economy will have to change anyway. That makes it somewhat less attractive to delay that change. But of course, these are all things that are very easy to say in hindsight, and we just didn't know at the time how long it would last or what the long-term effect would be.
And Mr. Sunak's observation in evidence was that, here he was dealing with something that there was uncertainty about so many things: scale, duration, potential duration, the behavioural response, and the wider macroeconomic impact. So you've got uncertainty everywhere you turn in terms of trying to plan from a policy perspective.
Absolutely, and in addition, households obviously face a lot of that uncertainty as well, and so part of the challenge was trying to reassure them and give them as much certainty as possible. But that was difficult when the entire environment that the government was responding to was itself so uncertain and dependent on global factors and so on.
And so does that range of complicating factors mean that whatever any government had done would have required an element of making tough choices where you were balancing risk against potential trade-off?
100%, absolutely, and quick choices as well, because there was much of the damage and much of the potential long-term damage could have been done very quickly with a lack of an effective and quick response. which also further limits your ability to fine-tune certain elements of the design of policy. And again, I'm sure we may come back to this when we come to specifics, but that also made it much, much harder.
And so on the question of speed, and we will, as you say, come back to it when we look at the specifics of certain policies, but those who say, well, you could have sat back and just seen how it all developed and, not rushed into this or that or the other. The nature of this shock meant there was an absolute imperative to do something quickly, and whichever way you jumped, there were going to be trade-offs.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know who would be arguing that we could have just sat back, but yes, absolutely. I would certainly argue against that notion that the risks here were not symmetric in some sense. If you act too little, too late, if you don't get the right support out quickly enough, then much of the damage could be done very, very quickly in terms of, again, we can come back to the specifics, but in terms of people losing jobs to which they actually were well suited and had a viable long-term future. Firms going bust that would actually have had a viable long-term future but couldn't survive the crisis. If you don't act quickly enough to shore up and prevent those things from happening very early on in the crisis, it'd be very hard to undo the damage, and it could last for a very, very long time.
I mean, I think we heard the sit back and do nothing as an option really being promoted in terms of monetary policy. The idea that the bank didn't have to act, the bank could have just sat back and seen how things settled. That was really in the evidence where we've heard that. But the governor's reaction to that was, no, we had to go big and go fast because we needed to stabilise. So that's why I mentioned it, just for your benefit, because I'm sure you haven't heard all of the evidence. Now, I just want to pick this up as the next topic, really. The extent to which it's possible to assess the overall effectiveness of any policy response. And I think you describe it as being, the ability to assess that as being very challenging. So in the sense of what, for example, an inquiry can or can't do. From an expert perspective, is it near impossible to actually make that sort of qualitative assessment?
In a precise way, yes, it's essentially impossible. I think so. Perhaps it's useful to elucidate the main challenges that there are there. And the typical way, and in some ways the cleanest way, to try to understand the impacts of an intervention or a set of interventions would be to use some kind of counterfactual analysis, which would typically involve trying to find a group of people, say, who in some sense narrowly miss out on being eligible for some intervention, compare what happened to them with a group of people who fell on the other side of that threshold or boundary and were eligible, and a comparison reveals the impact of the intervention, or the relative impact, I should say, on those two groups of people. Which brings me to the first difficulty, which is when you're dealing with a sort of macro, an economy-wide shock and an economy-wide sort of set of interventions that will not just impact the specific people who actually, for example, benefit from the furlough scheme, but will have a macroeconomic effect. It can help to stabilise the macroeconomy by providing more certainty, by shoring up incomes and so on. Well, that could be something that everyone in the country essentially could benefit from in principle. So comparing one group with another is not going to reveal the size of that kind of benefit, which is clearly a big part of what the overall response was about, macro stabilisation.
So it's not a true comparison, it's artificial because of all the other effects of the policies.
Yeah, you're sort of comparing, to take the example, and there were examples of this, of evaluations done of the furlough scheme, which did involve a comparison of people who narrowly missed out on being eligible for it because of when their employment started, and those who just were eligible for it. What you're really doing there is you're comparing a group who directly benefited and also presumably indirectly benefited because they're part of the macroeconomy that could have been affected by a scheme of this size, with a group who only indirectly benefited, but they both indirectly benefited. So you're not capturing that effect. You're kind of netting that out by comparing the two groups. So that's as an example of how you're not capturing those kind of macro effects, which are very important. I think the other key point is that it is even harder to compare the set of interventions that we actually implemented with other hypothetical variants of those, which in a way is the interesting question, because I think no one's suggesting that we should have done nothing. So really what we would like to know ideally to learn lessons is what was the effect of what we did compared to the effect of other things that we could have done. And for that, you're relying on things like cross-country evidence. Different countries took somewhat different approaches. You can perhaps take something from comparing the experience of different countries, but you're into a much less clean setting there, because different countries differ in all sorts of other ways as well, including the dynamics of the pandemic itself, for example.
And would that sort of cross-country analysis also depend on factors like the state of any other country's economy before the pandemic, the composition of another country's economy, because different countries will have economies composed in different ways, the size of the labour market, and all of those factors that are very difficult to sort of model out into a true comparison? Absolutely,
all of those factors. Yeah.
So you can broadly look and say, well, take furlough. The US, the United States of America, didn't have a furlough scheme. It went for welfare rather than furlough, but we've heard why that is. But you're comparing apples with oranges if you try and say, well, that could have meant a different outcome in the UK if you'd have followed it.
Yeah, certainly. If you're trying to arrive at any kind of precise estimate of what would have happened here had we followed that path, yes. Maybe we can take some indicative broad brush things from comparing with other countries. I think we probably can take something from the US experience, in that I was quite struck in that example by the fact that the employment rate did bounce back quite quickly there after the initial big fall. And I think that's interesting, and we might, maybe we'll come back to what we might learn from the US or other countries. But in terms of delivering from that a precise estimate of what would have happened to us if we'd gone down their path or the path of some other country, I don't think that's realistic.
And when you're attempting any sort of evaluation of the effectiveness of government economic intervention, how important is it to consider against any risks that government was taking by a particular course or another, with the impact of not doing anything, of not acting?
Crucial, and there is a potentially big asymmetry between the impact of not acting can be irreversible or very difficult to reverse if it results in important matches between employers and employees being destroyed, which are very hard to rebuild quickly. People have spent a long time searching for the right job, maybe going from employer to employer to employer, trying to find the right job. And if they have to restart that process all over again, because their job cannot survive what might have been a relatively short term, in the face of where relatively short term help might have helped that job to survive, that's a long term cost potentially that's very hard to reverse. Plus, of course, the macroeconomic stabilisation elements. If you don't intervene quickly enough, provide certainty, shore up incomes enough, the crisis itself could become entrenched for the reasons we haven't explained the multiplier effect and macro stabilisation, but this is a risk if the government doesn't intervene in a macroeconomic shock quickly, that the crisis itself can become entrenched and last for longer. So the risks of inaction, of not doing enough, can be quite immediate and quite large and often quite hard to reverse. The risks of perhaps action that might be a little bit more blunt than would be ideal if we have more time to design things in a more fine-tuned way are a little bit different. I mean, there are risks there, but you have the ability afterwards to go back and try to refine things, to fine-tune things. Whether they did that enough in this crisis perhaps is a question, I think, an open question. But the risks of acting too slowly and not doing enough, particularly in the immediate emergency, were potentially very, very large, and I think outweighed the risks on the other side of the ledger.
Okay. And would you just briefly explain that macroeconomic multiplier effect and how that works?
Yeah, so this is the concept that when there is a crisis, which is not just affecting specific households, but is affecting a large number of households at the same time, that it can multiply. To give an example, if there's an initial set of economic shocks which hit the incomes of a large group of people, that reduces, they spend less because they have less income. If they spend less, then that's essentially less consumer demand. So the firms who would have sold things to those people suffer from that. Obviously, the owners of those firms could suffer directly in terms of their incomes, but they also might have less demand then for labour to make the stuff that would have been bought by these people who are now buying less. So that means fewer people or less wages for a set of workers because of that lower demand for labour. So then you've got an additional group of people who are affected beyond that first round effect. So when you've got an income shock affecting lots of people at the same time, it can propagate through the economy. You have these second and third round effects. And part of the role of policy during a macroeconomic crisis, therefore, is to try to stop that propagation from happening, to cut it short by shoring up incomes when the crisis hits, in order to stop the crisis becoming more entrenched and long-lasting than it would otherwise be. So those kind of propagation effects are sometimes known as multiplier effects, which is what I referred to, I think, in my previous answer.
Can we then move on as the next topic to look at sort of big policy levers, and in particular, the choice, it is a binary choice, I don't think it is necessarily, between income protection, full stop, and income protection through job matching, and balancing those as two concepts. I mean, you have a situation in the pandemic where government mandates that for health reasons you can't go to work, you have to stay at home, affects the ability of people to go out and earn, therefore, and then on the face of it, incomes will fall. Options available: one, just protect income, so just give people money, or two, protect income through retaining jobs and job links. What are the advantages and disadvantages of those two policy options?
So I think at this point it's useful to introduce the concept of kind of matching or the quality of matches that exist in the labour market, in particular between sets of employees and the employers that they work for. So you could think of it in a normal economy, in the normal state of affairs. People are essentially shopping around in their careers. They spend some time with an employer that they think is well suited to them. They may then find that there's another job that they want to take instead, which almost by definition means on some level they're judging that would be an even better match for them, whether because it better matches to their skills or their family circumstances, their preferences, whatever it might be. And similarly on the firm side, firms are looking for the best workers to undertake the tasks that they need doing. So there's this constant kind of matching process in the labour market. And on the eve of a pandemic, you've got an economy where there's a set of employers and a set of employees matched to each other, and that is essentially the sort of a snapshot of the culmination of a process whereby employees have often spent many years shopping around trying to find the best employer, and the same thing on the employer side. So the key point is that there is some value in the set of matches that exist at any point in time, and if you just sever them all, there is no guarantee that people will just immediately find matches, and this is true both on the employer side and the employee side, that they will immediately find matches that are as good as what they had before, which took time and effort potentially to find. So,
I mean, leaving aside time and effort, what effect does not having good matches have on the wider economy and that?
Yeah, so essentially if people are less well matched to the jobs that they're in, then that has implications for productivity. and therefore for the amount that we're producing with a given amount of labour, and that affects the size of the economy and therefore all of us in terms of our living standards and prosperity. So it can be an important determinant of productivity. So the goal of job preservation, I think, a big part of it, and a big part of the rationale for it, is to stop the severing of these matches. So one analogy I find quite useful here is a ladder. So if you imagine that people's kind of career trajectories are essentially they're on a ladder, they're on a rung of the ladder, and occasionally they move up a rung because they see a job that they think is better for them, they're better matched to. Again, you can tell the same story from the side of the employers looking for the best workers as well. If you fall off the ladder, there's no guarantee that the next rung you're going to get onto when you get back on the ladder is as good as the one you were on before. So as soon as you allow employer-employee matches to become severed, even if they had a viable long-term future, just because they can't weather a short-term crisis, that can do long-term damage because there's no guarantee you're going to get back quickly to a situation where people are as well matched to their jobs as they were before. So I think that's one key rationale for something like a job, for a scheme that doesn't just protect incomes, but also ties that to the preservation of the kind of job of the employer and employee matches that existed at the start of the crisis. If you weren't worried about that, or about the cost of having to go through lots of rehiring of workers after the crisis is past, well, then you'd be more attracted to. Then the main goal really is just income protection, which in itself doesn't require the freezing of the set of jobs that existed before the crisis. You can do that through other means.
So this is just giving people money rather than preserving their jobs, essentially.
Yeah.
Which is what happened in the United States, is that right? It was support through welfare, effectively.
That's right. They essentially sent out a lot of checks to households that had no relation to exactly to whether or not they were remaining attached to the employers that they had at the start of the pandemic. I think that was largely or entirely explained by what they could do, what they had the administrative apparatus to do. But yes, that was a very different approach that they took. Yeah.
And the balance between the two, income protection and job matching, or which is preferable, does the likely duration of an economic shock perhaps influence which way you go?
Well, potentially yes. Again, I think the ladder is quite a good way of explaining this. So you've got people in their careers essentially gradually climbing a ladder, moving to new rungs when they think that they found a rung that's more appealing than their current one, i.e. a new job. And that happens in the normal course of events. So if you take a 2-year period, for example, many people over that period in the economy would have decided for some reason or other to take a job that they think is better matched to their skills or their circumstances or their preferences. So there's this natural churn in the economy, which is essentially about, or a lot of it is about maintaining alignment between people's skills, their preferences, and the jobs that they're in. What a job preservation scheme is trying to do, quite reasonably, is to stop people falling off the ladder completely and having to sort of start again or move back onto a lower rung of it. What it is also, however, doing kind of unavoidably is providing less of an incentive for people who might otherwise have moved up a further rung just in the normal course of events for some other reason, because they found a better job that they're better matched to, from doing that. Because, of course, now you're in the case of the furlough scheme, you're no longer comparing just a new, potentially slightly more suitable job for you with your current one. You're comparing that new job with a scenario where you can spend longer in your current one getting 80% of your wages without actually working. So that freezing effect can have a very, very positive effect in stopping people falling off the ladder and having to start again. But also over time, it'll be preventing more and more of the sort of normal churn where people would otherwise have moved up that ladder a little bit further. So the longer it goes on, the more of the latter effect you'll be getting as well, I guess, is one way of putting it. So that can change a little bit the sort of the calculus. Yeah. And it's something that I think that became quite relevant the longer this crisis and the longer this furlough scheme went on.
And so we know that in the UK, the decision was really to go for job protection and income support through that preservation of jobs and that job matching. But for those who aren't in work, there's obviously a requirement as well as there to think about, or those who lose employment so that their job is not preserved, to think about the welfare provision and for those two things to work in a complementary way.
Absolutely, and I think there's no world in which you wouldn't have had extremely strong case for just pure income protection measures as well, ones that were not tied to any job preservation scheme. There are people who, for various reasons, fell through the cracks in terms of not being supported by the coronavirus job retention scheme, were just made redundant instead, for example. On the self-employment side of things, the newly self-employed were not eligible for the initial rounds of the scheme that supported the self-employed group. So for lots of reasons, there are people who fall through the cracks of a job preservation scheme, including just simply people who still lose their jobs. So there was always a role for just straightforward income protection measures as well.
And in terms of those gaps and how far people fall, I mean, I suppose the height of the fall, the difference between having your job preserved through furlough and making a claim for universal credit may be quite significant, but we do tend then to get into pre-existing issues about the structure of the welfare state generally, don't we, and where the levels are set and how it's configured.
We do get into those issues. So if you have, people have different views on whether the pre-existing welfare system was generous enough or not. We'll tend to have different views on what should have happened to that system during the crisis. Although I think there is an interesting thing to reflect on in terms of just the balance of the measures implemented during the crisis, the precise balance where the dial was on that continuum between how much support was provided through the job preservation schemes versus the sort of more standard social security measures that were not tied. There was still the income protection, but not tied to the job preservation. I think you can have certainly there's a debate to be had about the precise balance between those things, which did affect this huge gap between how much people were entitled to if they managed to get onto the furlough scheme versus if, for whatever reason, they didn't. And that was a very, very big disparity.
But if the ultimate aim is to protect the economy or preserve it as best you can, and then try and ensure a rapid and strong recovery, there's merit, presumably, in putting jobs first and job retention and business preservation first, because that's going to enable that sort of swift and strong recovery more than if you put all your focus on welfare and income protection, unlinked to jobs. Is that right?
Yeah, that's I think absolutely fair. Yeah, if you don't have a job preservation goal as part of what you're trying to achieve, then there are very, very big risks of that. Again, come back to the point we perhaps discussed a little bit earlier, that there are risks in terms of long-term damage you might do to the productivity of the economy because of the destruction of these matches that might have had a valuable and productive long-term future, for example. The destruction of firms that had valuable capital and practices and so on that could be destroyed, that can be very difficult to undo. So yeah, the very, very strong focus on job preservation and on firm preservation as well at the beginning of the crisis was, in my view, entirely understandable and appropriate, and not something that I imagine that we should want to deviate from significantly if the same thing were to happen again. I think there is an interesting debate to be had about the precise balance between the two forms of support, however, the bit that's tied to job preservation, the bit that's not, and perhaps how the job preservation, the furlough scheme evolved over time, which maybe again we'll come back to. But I think that's where for me the real interesting debates are to be had, rather than about whether it was appropriate to have a job preservation objective in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. Can I move on to another topic then? And this is really the need for speed, as I've been want to term it, against finely tuned policy design. So this is the point that, yes, ideally, you'd like to precisely target any public money that you spend exactly where it's needed and nowhere else. But here there was existing infrastructure, and that limited options in terms of policy options, and there was this real need for speed. And I'll just, Mr. Joyce, go through some of the evidence we've heard. Mr. Sunak told us in his evidence speed was paramount. It was the one thing that was crystal clear. This was happening very quickly. It was about to have an extraordinary impact very fast on millions of people, their livelihoods and their businesses. And he said speed was of the essence, and he thought that the balance between speed and fine-tuning was appropriate. We heard a similar position from James Hara, Sir James Hara, former head of HMRC. Dan York-Smith said in the early part of the pandemic we had to move very, very quickly. And he spoke about, therefore, there were trade-offs in terms of consultation being reduced. Lord Sharma, similar perspective in terms of speed. And Sir Charles Roxburgh, former second permanent secretary at the Treasury, again, similar reflections. So from your perspective, looking at this as an expert, in that policy response, March 2020, was it right to prioritise speed before damage was done that might have been permanent?
Short answer would be yes. And, again, because really the core objectives that were being pursued, they wouldn't have been met at all if the support had been delivered too late. The firms would already have gone bust, people would already have lost their jobs. So none of the rest really matters if the package is delivered too late. Yes, speed was absolutely paramount. And this is particularly relevant for the initial emergency response. Maybe too little kind of, again, trying to be forward-looking and what lessons we can really learn. I guess the two things I would say around that would be how severe the trade-off is between speed and fine-tuning depends on what you come into the crisis with in terms of infrastructure. So if you have existing infrastructure that allows you, for example, to target certain policies in certain ways because of the data you have available and the administrative systems that you have available, well, then there isn't such a trade-off between speed and fine-tuning. So it does depend on what you come into the crisis with, which is one reason why I think, an inquiry like this and lessons learned like this can be useful in identifying what we might go into the next crisis with that would make that trade-off a little bit less severe.
Just coming in there, I mean, we heard from Dr. Tim Loynig, who was an economic advisor at the Treasury, that it might have seemed at first he was anti-planning, but really what he was saying was you can plan now in terms of getting infrastructure in place and getting data streams and getting the ability to deliver in place, but retain agility in terms of how you actually respond to a particular crisis. Is that where you would sit on the trade-off between absolute off-the-shelf scheme on the one hand and being able to remain agile on the other?
Broadly speaking, yes, in terms of an off-the-shelf playbook that sets exactly all of the parameters of a future scheme, I'm not sure how much value there would be in that, because they could depend on the details of each crisis and, frankly, what the world looks like when we next have a pandemic, which, the world in 2040, 2050 could be very different in relevant ways. Whereas investing in kind of the toolkit that the government has at its disposal to use that gives it more options for how to target policy, design policy in a more fine-tuned way, that I think is much more clearly something we can take into the next crisis when it happens, that we can be fairly confident will be useful in that crisis.
And the approach that Mr. Sunak advocated was really what he described as an iterative approach. So land the scheme, give the reassuring big announcement with a simple scheme that can be stood up and is deliverable within existing systems, And then, having done that, look at the rough edges if they emerge, iron out the problems over time, think about refinement over time. Does that, to you, sound like a sensible response?
That sounds like a sensible response. I think that potentially that if we were to have a crisis that looked similar to the one that we experienced in 2020, again, I guess I would hope that perhaps the time horizon for our thinking. So you do an initial emergency response, and then you think, right, how can we fine tune it? My sense is that there wasn't really much thought more than a few weeks or a couple of months or so ahead. There were things that perhaps could have been improved if efforts had been begun to do that in, let's say, April, May 2020, that a year later, when we still had a lot of the support measures, could have led to some fine-tuning and improvement. So I think we're not done because people were not, and policymakers were not looking that far ahead. So it was, I think that approach is right, but I would hope that maybe next time, again, I'm not an epidemiologist, maybe there is no guarantee that a pandemic that looks like COVID in February 2020 would last for a year or 18 months or so on. But I think we've probably learned that the time horizon is maybe a little bit different from how policymakers were sort of acting in the spring of 2020, where they didn't seem to be looking that far ahead.
Just a couple of points on that. I mean, you would always hope for the best in terms of a crisis being short-lived. But I think what you're really saying is, yes, but there wasn't quite enough planning for the worst, planning for the fact it might not be resolved as quickly as people are hoping it will be. And so you should start that policy work. You stand up the scheme, but don't let inertia then creep into it. Start the policy work on longer-term refinement straight away.
Exactly. I think that'll be a helpful mindset shift in the next crisis if it looks remotely similar to how this one did. Yeah.
Now, I mean, I suppose the answer to that might be, well, it didn't actually work like that. It looks like that in hindsight, but at the time it was one crisis followed by another, followed by another, followed by another, and there wasn't really time to look at schemes because there was another scheme that was required or another intervention required. Mm-hmm. But presumably looking forwards, we've now had that learning, so you bake that in at the outset. Is that the point you're making?
Yeah, I mean, there is always a question, of course, of essentially of state capacity and how many things it can do at the same time. But, you know, I guess just my sense is there are things, to take an example which can be useful, things like the very blunt targeting of the self-employed income support scheme, the fact that there was a cliff edge in that scheme at £50,000 is one example of something that I think it would not have been beyond our wit to change had we taken steps early on to figure out how to do that. I think it was something that was hard to perhaps to have a sort of more gradual tapering immediately, but if we'd thought in May 2020, you know what, in 7 or 8 months' time we'd like to be able to do this in a slightly more refined way, my sense is that would have been achievable. It's just as one specific example. And my sense of why that, and this is partly from reading other witness statements as well, of why that didn't happen is because people just were not looking that far ahead and they were sort of operating as though these schemes would not exist more than a couple of months ahead.
Yeah. So looking at those sorts of potential changes you could make to schemes, can we start with the job retention scheme? And this is a point that cropped up regularly with Mr. Sunak across lots of different interventions. On the one hand, you've got this, or he spoke of this desire to announce simple, accessible, easy to understand schemes. But on the other, spoke about protecting public money and targeting being desirable if you could achieve it, but that there were trade-offs between the simplicity of a scheme and targeting and the ability to target. So if we sort of pick that up in the job retention scheme as a general proposition, we'll look at how it could be done, but if it could be done, is targeting a desirable aim of a scheme like the job retention scheme from an economic perspective?
I suppose I would certainly think it is that the ability to target based on certain strong correlates of the severity of an effect of a pandemic on different parts of the economy. The ability to do that is a useful part of the toolkit. And again, just to sort of step back as to why we might want to do any of this, there is this potential trade-off, and that's taking the CJRS as the key example here. You want to support jobs and businesses that have a viable long-term future that would otherwise be unable to weather the crisis. Ideally, you would also want to minimise the extent to which you're preventing the sort of normal healthy churn that happens in an economy, where people move to a job that is somewhat better suited to them than their current one, where their skills are a better match and so on. You ideally want to prevent that from happening. There's going to be a trade-off, and you cannot perfectly identify which firms have been and which jobs have been most affected by the pandemic versus which are perhaps struggling for other reasons, for example. However, there are clearly decent predictors of that, or at least there are things that are correlated with it. If you look at data, and I think sector is perhaps the most contentious example here, but if you just look at macroeconomic data, it's very, very clear that if you look at vacancies or economic activity levels, there was a very, very strong correlation between sector and the impact of a pandemic. So if you look at someone who, to take extreme examples, someone who works in a nightclub, clearly the probability that their job is being impacted by a purely short-term issue is greater than if you look at somebody in a somewhat less directly affected sector. I think the question ultimately, this all comes down to how strong a correlation do you need in order to actually want to use this for policy purposes? Because clearly there are examples of people who might be in a sector that is on average less affected by the pandemic, but where their firm is very heavily affected because they sell to sectors that are locked down, for example.
This is the supply chain point, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the health restrictions, you close hospitality, so you close your restaurant. So that's a sector that's definitely affected. You can identify that. If you're farming English shorthorn cattle in North Yorkshire, you can't sell to the restaurant, so you're affected as well. Yep. Not that I am, by the way, but anyway. But it does just an example.
Why you chose North Yorkshire, Mr.
Well, no reason, my lady. Pure coincidence. Sorry. So how do you square that circle between saying, oh, we know that this business has been affected because lots of other businesses in the supply chain might have been affected, and that's really what Mr. Sunak came to, that he did want to do this and he looked at ways of doing it, but couldn't. Do you think it is achievable?
Yeah, first of all, I think the experience of someone like Mr. Sunak, I saw similar comments from Dr. Leunig as well. People who have sat for hours and hours within government at the time, looking in very concrete terms at the edge cases, the kind of people you'd be excluding from this, and that counts for a lot, and there's difficult to substitute for that. However, in the end, it simply comes back to how strong a predictor do you need in order to be willing to use it? The supply chain complexity is just an example of why it's the case that sector is not perfectly correlated, and indeed, in many cases, very imperfectly correlated with the impact of the pandemic. It's still the case, just despite that, it clearly is very strongly correlated. Again, you just see that in the macro data. I think the way I would come down on this is, again, keeping it, I guess, kind of forward-looking. Like, would we want to be able to have this in our potential toolkit in a future pandemic? We did do this in some other areas of policy. We targeted by sector, again, despite you could make similar.
So just pausing there, for example, grants. There were hospitality grants, there were business rate reliefs, they were targeted.
VAT cuts as well. So typically in a relatively narrow way. I'm not saying that you would necessarily translate exactly the same definition of which sectors would be included in different kind of parts of policy, but yeah, we use the ability to target by sector in some areas of policy where I think it was administratively straightforward to do that, given the data available. It doesn't seem to me inconceivable that we might want the flexibility to do something similar at some stage of a future crisis, perhaps when we're tapering down the scheme in order to to change that ratio between the proportion of firms we're supporting who are in that first group, who are just weathering a short-term crisis, and in the second group, where actually it might be better, all things considered, that they look for a new work, because the issue isn't just the short-term crisis. So would we want the option to do that? I think probably yes. We use the option in this crisis. The thing is, again, even the details, when the next pandemic hits, the details could all be different again. Like changes in technology could mean that it's a somewhat narrower set of sectors, for example, that just can't avoid social contact. It might make this targeting easier. It could be harder because the supply chain complexity has got even more complicated. I don't know, but I do know sector is very strongly correlated with the impact of a pandemic, and it will be because of its relationship to social contact. So I would say I'd welcome us having the option of being able to use sector in a fairly broad range of policy responses in a future pandemic. My understanding is there actually would have been practical difficulties because of lack of sort of up-to-date data in the case of the CGRS from doing this. And I would at least welcome us having resolved those difficulties so that it's there as an option.
So can I put it to you like this? Are you really saying that although those who were making the decisions in this pandemic did look at this and decided at the time that it was just not feasible, you wouldn't take that as meaning that you shouldn't at least now think ahead? Or could we get better data? Could we analyse it in a more effective way? Could we put ourselves in a position in a future emergency where we could achieve some element of targeting? Because if we could, I mean, is this the point? It's not just it costs less public money, it's also that it might be better for the economy because it preserves the job churn in sectors that you don't want to stagnate.
Yeah, exactly. It potentially could be better for the economy and enable a quicker recovery. I mean, again, there are risks if you leave out too many people. You may again have more of the lost valuable employer-employee matches than you wanted if you get the balance wrong and you leave out the wrong sectors. There are certainly risks either way. But as an option for how we might fine-tune policy, it seems to me one that's worth having in the toolkit, as we had in some other areas of policy, even in this crisis.
Yeah. And that's not just presumably targeting by sector, but really getting as much real-time information about business, where employees are based, which sectors they work in, gathering as much data as you can so that you could potentially target in lots of different ways in a future emergency.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, the two that spring to mind, to be honest, are location and sector. Just the things that are most likely to be correlated with the impacts of a contagious disease. Obviously location is, and then sector, because it does tend to correlate with dependence on social contact. Notwithstanding, that correlation is weakened by things like supply chain complexity and so on. So I think, location and sector, these are things that my understanding is that even if, in principle, it had been decided it was worth having a go at targeting the CGRS by those things, I think my understanding is there wasn't sufficient confidence in having reliable, up-to-date data on those things in the relevant data system, whilst there was in some other relevant data systems where it, in fact, was used to target policy by sector.
Can I just pick up some other issues about furlough in terms of concepts we've heard and where you sit on them, from an expert perspective? The concept of partial furlough, so that you can partially furlough employees. Dr. Loining, I think, felt that had been a worthwhile introduction. Where do you sit with that as a concept?
Yes, I think it made sense, and it made sense at roughly the point at which it was introduced, which was around when there was trying to encouragement to return to work, and at the time some loosening of restrictions were happening. I think it made sense in a context where it may well have been that full-time work in a number of environments was still unviable or undesirable because of the public health situation, perhaps, and ongoing constraints around things like childcare, for example. There were lots of reasons why perhaps full-time work was still not the best option for many people, jobs, but where there was scope for a gradual return to normal, and it support the incomes of those returning to part-time work who they might have been able to manage with 80% of their usual earnings while on furlough, but would have struggled with, 50% of their salary from working half time without extra support for the other bit. So I think it made sense to have a system like that, particularly at the kind of point that it was introduced. To the extent that it led people to work part-time rather than remaining furloughed at 0 hours, it would have saved the government some money, as well as being probably better for those people's careers. It could have also had some of the opposite effect. It could have made it more attractive for some people to work part-time rather than go full-time. That was also a possibility, and I don't think we fully know the balance of those two effects, and I'm not sure how we would do. I haven't seen an evaluation of this of any kind. But in general, there was also a decent evidence base for those sorts of schemes in European context pre-COVID as well, where sort of part-time work was supported. So yeah, on balance, I think it was a sensible amendment to the scheme.
Can I don't want to be timed out, but in terms of the self-employed scheme, I mean, you mentioned that earlier. As a scheme in which there were some hard edges, and again, Mr. Sunak conceded that in his evidence, that you either did or didn't qualify for the scheme on different bases. We go back, do we, to this point about speed? There was a need for speedy delivery of the scheme. You had to set the parameters somewhere and announce it in a simplistic way. But is this an example of a scheme where, in your view, over time, scheme inertia crept in? There were changes that could have been made and could have been thought about at the outset if the mindset had been, this might not be over in 4 months, this might still be here in a year's time.
Yeah, that is my sense. As I say, even partly from reading witness evidence elsewhere in terms of what was discussed within government. That yes, something like the lack of a tapering of support for the SACE scheme, whereby you either got it in full if your trading profits in the relevant period were £50,000 or under, and none of it if they were over. That is something that I'm sure could have been addressed with requisite time put into it, and so I infer that the reason why it wasn't is mostly because people were not thinking that far ahead.
And does the same point really arise in that there are a range of reasonable policy responses of any government? Things that are, the line's got to be drawn somewhere. You can or you cannot make certain choices. But this is about looking forwards, getting the infrastructure in place and the basic scheme infrastructure and the data, so that you could make these judgments in a future emergency which may have a different shape.
Yes, and in the case of the SACE scheme, I think there are other things along those lines that would be important as well. So it was a limitation that the lack of up-to-date data on the incomes of self-employed was also a key reason why in the initial rounds of the SACE scheme, people who were newly self-employed, or many people who were newly self-employed, going back to, I think, businesses that had started since April 29. Get this wrong now. I'll probably get this right. I'm trying to think of my feet now. But you basically had to have been self-employed for a number of months in order to qualify. With more up-to-date data on the incomes of the self-employed in future, and there is a sort of Making Tax Digital agenda that could help with this. That is something that could be. That lag is something that could be avoided in future crises. Even the first payment took a little while to arrive. It was made in May, I think, so somewhat later than employees. Employees basically had complete continuity through the furlough scheme in their incomes. The self-employed didn't have to wait a couple of months, and again, I think that might be something that could be sped up a little bit in a future crisis. And we did some work at the time while I was at the Institute for Fiscal Studies at the time, looking at the self-employed people who were waiting for their first payment in the May, and it was clear that their consumption was particularly depressed in the period while they were waiting for that payment, and then it sort of bounced back a lot as soon as it arrived, which was suggestive that this was it had a meaningful impact on their living standards, that they had to wait for that support as well. So I think that's another kind of rough edge, if you like, that could be smoothed out with the right preparation before the next crisis.
So really, from your perspective, this is about looking at what did happen and thinking through, okay, how could we now think about avoiding those rough edges, albeit that there's ultimately a policy decision to be taken next time, depending on the nature of the emergency and the policy decision available to the Chancellor?
Yeah.
Okay. Universal credit and the uplift there. I think your view is that is an example of targeting, effectively. Is that right? In terms of delivering the uplift to universal credit, is delivering it to people who've lost income or employment, effectively?
I mean, it certainly embeds an important form of targeting in that it's, first of all, it's a change that's targeted at those on low incomes. So it's, compared to something like the CJRS, for example, it's much more targeted at preventing poverty. Because it's based on your household income, like the benefit system is, and also takes more account of, although the £20 uplift actually did not, that was just a flat rate, so that did not take account of variations in needs and things like that, which is another issue that could be debated. But yeah, I mean, in that sense, it certainly was a targeted scheme. You could even you could certainly make a case as well that some targeting of that form at lower income households also actually made some sense from potentially from a more macroeconomic perspective, if you're trying to shore up consumer demand.
Yeah, we heard that from Mr. Sunak, that he gave that as one of the not the policy objective of the uplift, but one of the unintended benefits of the, or I suppose it could be an intended benefit, but it was the stimulation of macroeconomic demand. You gave people more money, they're going to spend it, therefore that helps the economy.
Yeah, you would generally expect that, at least in normal times, and there's plenty of evidence that is the case, that lower income households tend to consume more of any extra money that you give them. It was pretty hard to know how people's spending patterns were behaving during COVID, because there was so much unusual about it, including restrictions on where you can spend your money. But yes, it was reasonable to expect. I agree, it's reasonable to expect that a support targeted at lower income households is more likely to be spent. Yeah.
Just in terms of targeting on lower income households, one issue that has emerged in some of the evidence is this concept of whether you could create a household data set. It's how you could actually understand the requirements of any given household. And different views have been expressed. Where do you sit on that in terms of whether that's feasible, whether that's something that ought to be considered, whether it's possible to work up a household data set, or is that just too many variables and too difficult to define?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think so. There's two different purposes that you could use that for. First of all, this is to inform analysis and understanding of who's falling through the cracks in kind of policy provision, who's struggling most. There are all sorts of reasons why just having up-to-date data that you can analyse on households and how different kinds of households are doing is useful and can help with the targeting of policy and so on. Then there's there's data for the purposes of actually directly operationally using it to take households in that data and say, right, we're now going to mechanically, as a result of what we see in this data, give you this support or that support. So for the first purpose, for just to inform analysis and understanding in kind of something closer to real time in a fast-moving emergency, absolutely. First of all, yes, that's very, very useful. Yes, I think it also was notable that was happening in the pandemic, but sort of by people in a fairly bespoke way, making use of various disparate data sources from often in quite inventive ways, like bank account data and that kind of thing. Yes, it would be nice, I think, if there were a kind of workhorse, large-scale household data set that could maybe not one that would need to be permanently, like every month, even in normal times in the field, but that could be rapidly used and maybe increased to being a higher frequency, kind of, if it's a survey, for example, I'm thinking, during a crisis. So I think, and in a way that happened a little bit organically through a household survey known as the UK HLS, or Understanding Society, which did have sort of some extra, it was a long-running household survey of tens of thousands of households, and it did have some extra COVID waves to try to get more regular information during the crisis. But, that was limited and there were only a few of those. Something on a larger scale and even, more fine-grained in terms of frequency of measurement like that definitely could be really, really useful. In terms of sort of an administrative data set that covers all households that can be used directly to administer policy, I'm probably not the best person to ask, but it sounds like a very, very big job. I guess the most practical way I could think of potentially approaching that would be to essentially make more use of linkage of individuals who live together within HMRC's tax records, which are individually based, and combining those with perhaps benefits data from DWP.
I think the point that some made was that no one will want to give the government that sort of data. People are naturally suspicious about giving their data to government and wouldn't be very happy to hand it over, particularly not to HMRC.
Yes, I mean, there's it's perhaps HMRC, obviously going way back, we used to have a system of joint taxation where HMRC had to know, or at least try to know something about who lived with whom. We do not have that now. There are some other policies that have been introduced, which for reasons we needn't necessarily go into, sort of require kind of via the back door HMRC to actually have some sense of who lives with who in a very sort of indirect, crude way in order to do things like withdraw child benefit from higher income families because of the way that's being done. But it's not being done by actually creating a direct link between people in HMRC's records who live with each other, which I think is perhaps notable. Doing that sounds like maybe it's possible, and but it sounds like a huge task. But I'm probably not the best person to ask exactly how feasible it would be.
Can I pick up another topic? Loans and business support, risk against speed. Mr. Sunak this morning was very clear that to stress that yes, they knew that there was a significant fraud risk with bounce back loans, but there was an absolute imperative need to deliver support quickly, because if you waited to put things in place, the companies that needed the money would have gone out of business. And where do you sit in that?
Yeah, on that, I just agree. I don't think without much caveat, really. I mean, if that support had arrived too late, then it would really have been too late to achieve any of the objectives, because the objectives were all about stopping businesses from going under. It's not something that you can then easily undo if you come in too late with that first tranche of support. So it's a very sort of asymmetric situation where you just need to get the support quickly enough. If that requires bluntness, then that's probably what needs to happen. And the risk of fraud, I mean, that obviously is a very difficult one, and it was always there. It was always very clear, particularly when we reverted to the bounce back loan scheme, where there was 100% underwrite of the loans, and it was acknowledged at the time as well, of course, by policymakers. I don't have much to add on that.
No, but just coming in there, I mean, you mentioned earlier the multiplier effect, and if this is an area, isn't it, where you could really see that. If you act too slowly, so that the companies go out of business, it's not just the companies as entities going out of business.
Yeah.
It's all their employees losing their jobs, that income being lost. Therefore, they're not spending their income in the economy. And this can soon, can't it, really amplify as an effect. It's not just how many businesses might have folded in the space of 5 weeks. It's what is the ripple effect of that?
Yes, absolutely. It's exactly the macro and the micro picture. At the micro level, you can have valuable capital being destroyed that would take time to rebuild. And at the macro level, if this happens on a large scale, essentially the government would then be failing to provide that sort of macro stabilisation that I think is rightly a part of its role in a crisis.
And then the final topic I really want to pick up is about duration of schemes. I mean, we've spoken about the need for speed to stand them up. You've spoken about ideally, and in a future emergency, you would look to refine and launch schemes with an eye to they might last longer than you think. So think about how you might refine them. The decision about when to withdraw is also fraught with difficulty in an uncertain emergency. Do you agree?
Yes, and I tried to be quite clear in the report that I find it there's a lot that can be said in hindsight, perhaps, or a lot more that can be said in hindsight. And I think it was very difficult at the time to know the appropriate moment to withdraw it and how rapidly to withdraw it. But it is an important issue, of course.
And I just want to pick up on one other point that just arose in the evidence of Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England. And he spoke about the state of the economy post-COVID and the rise in economic inactivity. And he said that it still wasn't really very clear as to why we were seeing this rise in economic activity, but it was persisting in the UK economy, and that was quite an unusual thing. I mean, first of all, as an economist, having an increase in people who are economically inactive, so there hasn't been a strong return to the workforce. Is that of concern?
Yeah, absolutely. It affects the size of the economy in a very direct way, and it's also potentially worrying in terms of what it might say about the underlying causes of that, particularly perhaps around health. It's a very important issue for all of us in terms of the size of the economy and therefore for all of our prosperity. It places particular strain also on the finances of the government in particular areas. It seems to be related to huge increases in disability benefit spending as well, for example. So it's a very important issue to try to understand what's caused it and how it can be resolved, which I think we're not very far along on in that process, frankly.
And I just picked that up really in a forward-looking sense. We don't actually know, is this right, what the cause or potential causes are of that economic inactivity. There are a number of factors. It could be long-term health conditions that arose from the COVID pandemic. It could be mental health, an increase in incidence of mental health. It could be, people deciding to retire early. There are all sorts of possible issues. But is it important to now drill down into that and to progress this further? I mean, Mr. Bailey was concerned about it enough to mention it, so that in a future response, you're thinking about that, not only how you recover, but how you try and prevent long-term economic activity resulting from another emergency and your economic response to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be very valuable to understand more about how, if at all, if so, how it is related. This trend is related to things that happened during the crisis. The timing certainly looks, conspicuous. If you look at, again, I would come back to the rise in disability benefit claiming as a particular sort of indicator, which just really exploded from around the summer of 2021 and has remained at its new much higher level ever since. Which is obviously very concerning in terms of what it might be saying about people's health, and it may well be related to the wider labour market issues that we're seeing. It's because a lot of these issues are quite distinctive to the UK. We haven't seen the same rise in activity or in, as far as we can see, measures of health and health-related benefit claiming, for example, typically in most other comparable countries. So in some ways that increases the puzzle a little bit, because some explanations like long COVID or other things that you might think directly would fall out of a pandemic, that doesn't translate so well if we're not seeing anything remotely similar in most other countries. So I think that adds to the puzzle. But yeah, understanding whether it was related in any way to what we did during COVID or what happened during COVID would be important. There could, for example, be some analysis done potentially, I think, of how it might relate to whether or not people were furloughed, how long they were furloughed for, and that kind of thing. There's perhaps a little bit more juice to be squeezed out of what could be done analytically to understand this. But at the moment, I think it's a very, very murky picture, and we don't really know what's going on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joyce. Those are my questions, Melody. I don't know if there are any other questions.
No, I don't think there are any Rule 10 questions. Thank you very much indeed. I'm really grateful to you. You're obviously a great enthusiast for your specialist subject.
That came across.
Thank you very much for the help you've given to the inquiry, both in your written report and this afternoon.
Thank you.
Very well, I think that completes the evidence for today, and I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
All right.